Nintendo is a company we all love with all the games and consoles they have made.
But what did they do back then? What was their history?
That's what I'm going to talk about in this video. On September 23rd, 1989, Nintendo was founded by
Fusajiro Yamauchi.
As Nintendo started, the first name was chosen to be Nintendo
Kupai.
After the name was chosen, they started making standard 52 card decks as the first thing for Nintendo to do for the company. In 1959, Nintendo was starting to make and sell Walt Disney character printed cards with Mickey Mouse and a bunch of other types of things for the cards. In 1963, Nintendo Kupai was changed into Nintendo Co. Ltd. In 1975, Nintendo started to make an arcade game called EVR Race. Not much is known about the game, but we know it was a 6-player game, but not much is known about it, so it's pretty much a lost game from Nintendo. April 4th, 1981, one of the biggest video game mascots came to life. That was Mario Bros. While Mario did not have a game fully yet, he was a character named as Jumpman. He was also in a game called Donkey Kong, but the beginning of this game was not ideal. When Nintendo was trying to get an idea for Donkey Kong, the original plan was going to have the main character as a 1960s cartoon for the main character. And that character was going to be Popeye the Sailor Man. As Nintendo were trying to get rights for the game, sadly they weren't able to get the rights for Popeye the Sailor Man. So they had to make original characters that were very different from what they were. Fun fact, a couple years later, a Popeye the Sailor Man arcade game actually did release. The new characters' names were Jumpman, aka Mario, Donkey Kong, and Lady, which is another name for another Nintendo character called Pauline. After the game released, nothing really happened much, but 2 years later, this game was in grave danger. 1983. Nintendo was sued by Universal Studios for Donkey Kong being a trademark infringement of King Kong. Luckily, Nintendo was free due to the fact Universal did not have trademark rights for Donkey Kong. After Nintendo was done with the arcade system, they moved on to Nintendo home consoles. One of the very first consoles was called the NES. This was the very first console to make one of the most and a lot of popular games such as Mario, Zelda, Duck Hunt, and Mega Man, and a bunch more. After that, the newest console was called the SNES. This console had way more power and better games and higher quality. It also introduced a new controller. After that, this console was one of the biggest changes for Nintendo because this was the very first console to introduce 3D games. The Nintendo 64. The original name for this console was going to be Project Reality, or just Reality. This console came out at very different times. June 23rd, 1996 for Japan. September 26, 1996 for North America, and March 1st, 1997 for Europe and Australia. My dad actually used to own Mario 64 as a kid, so we talked about it, and he said his favorite level was Mazy Hayes Cave, and I showed him that I got into it in my save file. The next console is the Nintendo GameCube. This was an upgrade to the Nintendo 64 with way more power. This was the very first console to use discs as its power source. And yes, if you were wondering, it is shaped like a cube. This next console is literally one of my most favorite consoles that Nintendo has ever made. Reason? Motion controls. A lot of people don't like this gimmick, but I like it for many reasons. One example is Mario Kart, and the reason for it is you get to use the controller like it's an actual steering wheel, and Nintendo even made a real accessory to make it look like it's a steering wheel. Also, the Wii was sometimes able to play GameCube games, and you were able to find some slots for a memory card and a GameCube controller. There was also the Family Edition version of the Wii. Basically, it was just cheaper and you couldn't play GameCube games. Also, there was the GameCube Mini. You couldn't connect to the internet, you couldn't play GameCube games, and really, you could only just do one thing and play a game. I still have a Wii even to this day. My older sister used to have a Wii. She still does. But we used to own New Super Mario Bros. Wii, and usually all of us would play. But whenever I played, they would always make me go in a bubble. And whenever I got out, I couldn't. They made me go back in, which was really annoying. And that's why I have my own Wii now. The next console was the Wii U, and this thing was a very, very bad console. It had very poor sales. The only new things Nintendo did with it is just a brand new controller and more games. Nintendo wanted to take a step back and think about what they were doing for the next console, but they still wanted a little bit of the same idea for the Wii U, since it was such a failure. Finally, in 2017, the latest console, the Nintendo Switch, released. It was a console and a handheld, which we'll talk about later, and it came with 2 controllers and a dock so you could play on TV. That's where the console part comes in. This console was such a big success that it's still even going, with a lot of games coming out and even bigger models coming out as well. It even got more sales than the PS5. And now let's go on to the handhelds.
Handhelds. The very first handheld Nintendo made is the Game & Watch. The Game & Watch was not one game, it had many versions, and every one of them with different games, and with all of them like Ball, Mario, the Juggler, and Donkey Kong Jr. It had many layouts. Next handheld is the Game Boy Library, and first off, the Game Boy. Now instead of just buying a new Game & Watch, you could now buy the games and just slot them into the Game Boy. But many people had issues for its portability. First off, the screen is green tinted, and plus it was really dark. So if you had no light, you would have a hard time seeing the screen. Overall, it was a good handheld for its time. After that, the Game Boy Pocket was made with a smaller black and white screen with a shell. Nothing really happened before the Game Boy Light came out. The Game Boy Light fixed a problem from the original Game Boy, in that there was a black light that made you see the screen better. It was also the same size as the Game Boy Pocket, but sadly, this only came out in Japan. The last Game Boy from this series is the Game Boy Color. It came in all sorts of colors, and yes, it could play games in color with older Game Boy games too.
Fun fact, I once fixed a Game Boy for my teacher with some friends, and we got it to work. Yeah, we screamed really loud.
A lot of people think this is a console, but I don't think so. The Virtual Boy. This had to be one of the worst handhelds. It was like VR with no headband. Plus, the color was a really bad red. After no more Game Boys were made out of nowhere, the Game Boy Advance came out. Most of the games were SNES games for on the go. After the first Game Boy came out, the new SP came out with a lighter screen. The Game Boy Micro was just the same Game Boy, just very tiny. When the Game Boys came out, something else came out that not a lot of people knew about, and this was the Pokemon Mini. In total, this only sold, well, no one knows how many units it sold, but it was a failure after just 1 year. It was stopped being sold with only 10 games.
The DS was a big hit, being one of the highest and most sold handhelds ever. The DS was in fact the first handheld with 2 screens that goes to one of the Game & Watches. The DS was just like the Game Boy SP, plus it could also play Game Boy Advance games, but later models did not have that. It also had the bottom screen that was touchscreen, with a pen that you could play with the screen to do actions. After the DS, the next handheld was the 3DS. Not really anything changed, but for that there was no Game Boy slot for your Game Boy games and had a 3D effect for the screen. It also just had more power, and plus it could also play older DS games. Also with the Switch, there was also some things called the Switch Lite. They were just switches, but they had no Joy-Cons to play with 2 people, and you could not play on the TV. These aren't really handhelds, but I didn't really know where to put them. The NES Classic and the SNES Classic. They were just the same thing, but only that the games were already in the console/handheld, so you just bought it. And that's it. Same with the Switch. The sales are still going with over 10 million units being sold. I say Nintendo's a really fun and creative company. If you haven't tried anything from them, I guarantee you will find something for you. They have almost anything for you. On anything with their consoles, handhelds. Heck, maybe you could even find some board games. Till then,